Hello, everyone. I am Paul Schultz, and I want to thank you for being a part of the second quarter College of Arts and Science Colloquium of the 2021 Colloquia series. And we are especially excited to have with us Dr. George Koo and Dr. Christy McMahon speaking on bundling effective educational practices to ensure quality 21st century learning and teaching. During today's presentation, you may post questions in the chat, and we will use them to facilitate a Q&A session with Dr. Koo and Dr. McMahon at the end of his presentation. Also, please keep an eye on the chat toward the end of the presentation for a link to an important follow-up survey, as we appreciate your feedback. At this time, I'd like to turn over our presentation to Dr. Tony Farrell, Interim Dean, UAGC's College of Arts and Sciences, and he'll make the introduction of our speakers.
Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me? Thumbs up?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Great. And my camera is not turned on, so I think you control that. That's probably a good thing. So I'll just go ahead and give the introduction. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. George Koo. Dr. Koo is Chancellor's Professor Emeritus of Higher Education at Indiana University. He is a founding director of IU Center for Postsecondary Research, the National Survey of Student Engagement, and the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. So George has more than 400 publications and made several hundred presentations on topics related to assessment strategies, institutional improvement, college student engagement, and campus cultures. He has consulted with about 400 institutions and organizations in the US and abroad. His recent books include Using Evidence of Student Learning to Improve Higher Education, Ensuring Quality and Taking High Impact Practices to Scale, High Impact Practices, and Student Success in College, Creating Conditions That Matter. His work has been recognized with awards from the American College Personnel Association, American Educational Research Association, Association for Institutional Research, Association for the Study of Higher Education, Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, Council of Independent Colleges, National Association of Student Personnel Administrators, and National Center on Public Policy and Higher Education, as well as 11 honorary degrees. It is with great pleasure that we have Dr. Koo with us today. He is a great friend to University of Arizona Global Campus. Also very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Christy McMahon today, who is lead faculty in the Department of Health Sciences. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Koo, and thank you for being here today. Thanks, George.
Tony, thank you very much for that splendid introduction. It's exactly how I wrote it. You left out the part about my being elected fifth grade vice president of my class. I don't know how that dropped off, but anyway, it's great to be with you all. I wish I could see you all. Wish I was in person with you all. And thanks to Christy McMahon for joining me today. Right. Oh, by the way, I should say this long, convoluted title was something that Paul Schultz designed for me in a conversation that we had several months ago. Actually, we ended up talking about a lot of different things, and so I'm going to try to cover a few of those along with Christy today. And just as I thought, the screen has locked up on me, Paul. Have you stopped sharing the screen? Let me see if I stop sharing and come back to it, and we get a little more action here. Just the way it's supposed to work, right? Okay, Christy, take it away. I don't
Dr. Koo, I can go ahead and share my screen if you just want me to. Oh, it looks
Now,
like.
let's see.
There we go.
There
How
you
do
go.
we get rid of, I have something in the middle of my screen here. 122 people. Very good. All right. So we're off to the races here. Just a reminder about how awful things have been the last 15 years or so in American higher education. A lot of public criticism, skepticism, as this said, most of it, much of it anyway, around cost and of course the increasing debt. But there's also a fair amount of discomfort about the relevance of what it is we do and of course how well we do it. I don't know what's going on here because it's not, my screen is not moving. All right, can you advance it from your end?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, this is unfortunate. It was working just fine.
Here?
Yeah. Well, this is a cartoon. It's meant to make you smile a little bit. And also, I ought to just very quickly mention that this is not a slam on the cultural and performing arts. In fact, I had the great pleasure of directing something called the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project some years ago. And we followed the careers of people with arts intensive training. And there is a lot to learn about entrepreneurship and make multiple jobs at the same time and so forth. But I want us to focus on the bullet there, which is what more and more people and especially employers are focused on. Next slide, please. So this is, some of you may remember this from the mid 80s. This was a commercial that Wendy's did, it was trying to impress people about how big their burger was. That's Clara Peller, the one who's on the right there holding the phone. 81-year-old Clara Peller actually developed a cottage industry for herself from that, appeared on all kinds of nighttime shows and so forth and so on. But the point here is more and more people want to know, next slide, please, where's the beef? Where's the beef? Employers want to know where's the beef, and they are creating very, very high expectations for us. And I think rightfully so, but you got 9 out of 10, let your eyes go down this list. 9 out of 10 say they need more from college and university graduates. The challenges are more complicated. We just need more. Next slide, please. Did someone say I'm on mute? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, somebody just chatted that in the box. So a couple of words about what the world now wants from us, and that means what the world wants from UAGC, and then just a quick review of what these essential 21st century learning outcomes are, and then a couple more deeper dives into some of the things that we can rely on to make certain that we are delivering what it is students and the world wants. And then I'll close out with a couple of other comments. Next slide, please. So what does the world want? Whoa, what does it need? And what does our democracy need? Well, you can read that for yourself. Knowledge, proficiencies, dispositions, which we don't often talk about, but I will a little bit later. How do we prepare people to be self-sufficient? And also to be informed and civically engaged so that they're contributing to the betterment of the communities as well as their own life. Next slide, please. Well, what we know from decades of research is what really matters in college is whether students do the right things, whether they're spending time and effort on what we know to be, in my language, educationally purposeful activities. And we've come to call this student engagement over the last 20, 25 years. Next slide, please. There are a lot of bells and whistles here that matter. I think we got stuck on that slide. Are we not stuck on there? We go. So a lot of things that take place in the classroom can be highly engaging. This is a longer list maybe than you want to look at. I'm not going to go through all of these things. Maybe someday we'll have some time to spend a few hours talking about these kinds of things. Many people on the line right now are doing many, if not all of these things. I just want to mention that first one, which came to me late in my teaching career, classroom organization. This is the point where if an instructor spends 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning of every class hour, talking about where we've been, what we intend to do today, and what the 3, 4, 5, 6 major learning outcomes or points to take away. Students hear that in the first 3 to 5 minutes, they walk away from that class hour having consumed and learned more and retained more than if we just jump right in. It's often, I was included in this, I didn't want to, quote, waste time, telling students what they ought to attend to. They were supposed to divine that in some way. Next slide, please. And there are other kinds of policies and practices, institution level, if you will, can be sometimes at the program level, that we ought to make, we just ought to make them mandatory. We ought not to let students register for class late. I don't think that's a problem at UAGC with the 5-week class, but it is at many other places. And almost all institutions today have what they call early warning systems, but how effective are they, right? Let's go to the next slide. We could spend more time on these, but we won't. My point here, walking away from these first few slides, is that we can't do just one of these things, or even 2 of them. All right. What happens? You create a culture of student success when the institution is pulling these effective educational levers all across throughout the institution. And we need to be sure that what we're trying to do with the learning and teaching settings is that we're focused on the outcomes that are demanded of students today. Next slide, please. So the Association of American Colleges and Universities have been kind of at this chore, a major task for almost 20 years with their Liberal Education and America's Promise campaign. They called it wisely a campaign. This wasn't something they were going to do in 1 or 2 or 3 years. It's been ongoing now since the mid 2000s. And they parsed out, if you will, 4 chunks of essential learning outcomes. Next slide, please. And just to remind us, of what these are. It's the knowledge stuff, right? This kind of crystallized intelligence, things we need to know across a variety of disciplines. But they've also added this bump line down at the bottom, right? They can't just deliver information to students. They somehow have to be connected to the things that our students are facing, our world is facing in real time. Next slide, please. And these intellectual practical skills, the things we hear so much about from employers. Employers really don't say much about how much a student knows. They're quite satisfied almost always with the major field outcomes. What they do drill us at are whether students can read and write effectively, whether they can work effectively with other people, whether they can interpret numbers and draw and take away the implications of those numbers. And again, the bullet line here across the bottom is students need a lot of practice doing these things, a lot of practice. Next slide, please. So this category of personal and social responsibilities, we talk a pretty good game in American higher education, but we don't, for example, offer majors in these areas, right? These are to buttress and support and to make a person's life more fulsome and responsible. But how do students learn and get, again, practice in doing these kinds of things? Next slide, please. The final slide here about deep integrative learning. And that's something that we have spent a lot of time talking about. But as you read through those bullets and what follows, I want to ask you to be thinking about in your own teaching circumstances, where do you focus on the idea that students will in fact learn how to apply on their own what they're learning. Next slide, please. A little deeper dive here into deep integrative learning. These are the kinds of things that kind of signal to people whether a student, whether one of us is able to practice deep integrative learning. It's more than just knowing stuff. It's understanding its relevance and being able to combine ideas across not just courses, but life experiences, right? And being able to use what we know in different situations, which requires that we we modify what it is we think we know to fit the circumstances. And of course, never been more important than that last bullet, to see the world through someone else's eyes, view them from multiple perspectives. Next slide, please, if you will. So how do we ensure, right, that students, in fact, are mastering, attaining these kinds of outcomes? Well, the single best way to do it, we have batteries of instruments, you know, the assessment stuff, but the single best assessment approach is to design assignments that really require students to demonstrate that they have achieved the learning objectives in a given course. Next slide, please. So this is what you would expect from an English major like me, finding X. Next slide, please. Supposed to be funny. Let's move it along, okay? So this is the best evidence. Assignments that we design, and too often, guilty as charged here. I spent more time, again, in the 35 years that I was on the faculty at Indiana University at teaching assignments. I spent more time picking out the readings for my class in those days than I did thinking about the nature of the paper I wanted students to write, or the final exam, and so forth and so on, and not to mention linking what it was we were doing in class with those intended outcomes. So, you know, if we leave with one thing today in our mind's eye, it would be to take a fresh look, and perhaps in the company of other colleagues, about the nature of our assignments and whether they're teasing out, next slide, please, what it is we want students to know and do. We don't often talk with colleagues about these things, but is there a more powerful signal to students about what's important in this course, in this program? And if we do this well, we can expect the students to benefit in the ways in which we and employers and their family members want them to. And this work is not easy. And it ought to be something that the institutional reward system takes into account, recognizes. Next slide, please. So a lot of things make up a good assignment. You know, one of the most important is, do students understand it? And oftentimes we spend very little, if no time, talking about what it is we want out of that assignment. And there ought to be opportunities for us to give students feedback. Feedback is the most powerful lever we can pull to improve student performance. It's true of our own lives in every dimension of human endeavor. In fact, you know, if you don't get feedback, you don't improve. A lot of other things that we can say about good assignments, including whether we're taking into account the previous performance and learning opportunities students have had, and the other assignments that they may be challenged with. Next slide, please. Now I get to turn this over to my new colleague, Christy McMahon, to give us some on the ground, if you will, information about how this stuff works in real time.
Thank you, Dr. Koo. So I was asked to share some examples of how I engage students and assess specific learning outcomes within my classes. So I'm going to share two examples from our HWE 415 stress management course. As you can see here on the slide, I've included the course description as well as the learning outcomes for the slide. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read through each of these today, but I wanted to let you know I will be focusing on two of the learning outcomes. The first one will be the learning outcome number 3, analyze the relationship between stress and health, and the learning outcome number 5, evaluate how behavioral change theories and motivational strategies can be used to implement stress coping strategies. So I'll be providing examples of how I designed some assignments that assess these two specific learning outcomes. So next slide, please. So for this class, I wanted to create some interactive learning activities instead of the traditional discussions and written assignments. And I just felt like this was a more engaging way to allow the students to apply these specific learning outcomes. And in this specific learning activity, I created a scenario. This is about Jordan, a single father of 2 children. He has some very common stressors that many of us experience: work demands, work conflicts, health issues, and finances. So next slide, please. And then as you can see here on this slide, the course learning outcome of focus again is analyze the relationship between stress and health. And on the previous slide, the situation or the scenario was presented to the student. And so they now have to determine which health risk is Jordan putting himself at risk for if he doesn't learn how to control his stress. And so they choose whichever diseases apply in this case. And it's not like we just ask these students to do this without learning about the information first. Students are expected to read the textbook and then apply this information to the learning activity. So next slide, please. And this is a second of 2 learning activities within this course. Now I have designed other courses that follow the same client or the same person in 2 separate activities, which is great for scaffolding. But for this particular class, I thought it would be best to create 2 separate learning activities because it was 2 different learning outcomes I wanted to have the students evaluate. So on here, the students are analyzing the relationship between stress and health. And we're looking at this case study on Candace. And again, the opening slide provides some background information on how to use this information to complete the learning activity. This is Candace, who is an obese 35-year-old mother of 2, and her doctor has just recommended that she lose 30 pounds to reduce the risk of developing a chronic disease. So next slide, please. And the entire learning activity takes the student through Candace's journey of changing her behavior and how she all went through the stages of change to lose weight. Particularly, students are to evaluate how behavioral change theories and these motivational strategies can be used to implement stress coping techniques. And students learn about the different behavior change theories again in their weekly readings or in the textbook, and then they come back and actually apply this to Candace's situation, to more of a real life situation. And in this example, students are presented with the stages of change. Some of you may know that as the trans-theoretical model. And the situation provides Candace's current level of change. And then before going to the doctor, the question states that Candace is unaware of the health risk related to obesity. So then the student has to select the correct stage of change here. So next slide, please. And in this last example, we see how both learning outcomes are applied in this learning activity. The health risk is actually presented within the question. It's just kind of a reminder again to the students of the health risks related to stress, but then the student has to select the correct concept, the behavior change concept, as the answer. And one thing that's really great about these learning activities is that students can retake it. They can read the information and go back and forth. There's no time limit, so that's another great benefit to the student. And another thing is students, they receive feedback immediately, as Dr. Koo had mentioned how important that is. They can take, for each slide, they click submit result and they know immediately if they got that right or not. Now, if they did get an incorrect score, they finish the activity and then they can retake it again. So that's beneficial as well. And so next slide. And I just thought I would add a few comments here of some of the great things that students are saying about these interactive learning assignments. You know, they're really wanting to be fully engaged in the class. And while I still value written assignments and discussions, I think students just need some variety. You know, adding these learning activities really presents them with some information that they can try to apply to some real world scenarios. So that's very beneficial to them. So thank you, Dr. Koo, for letting me share, and I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, thank you, Christy. That was terrific, and I suspect there'll be a lot of questions coming your way. So speaking about assignments and well done assignments, one of the things that we did at NALOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, over the last few years is we invited faculty members to submit what they consider to be their very best or one of their very best assignments. In fact, we hosted several what we called charrettes, assignment design charrettes around the country, where small groups of faculty 8, 10 from different disciplines would come together and share their best assignment. What are the outcomes we're after? What are the kind of student tasks at hand? What kinds of feedback? And they tweaked those assignments based upon the feedback they got. And so we've been curating them and hosting them on the NALOA website. And you can see a couple of links at the bottom here. So the assignment design charrette, it's a very popular activity, and we did I don't know, half a dozen of those, and then individual campuses began to do their own. So you get groups of faculty giving one another feedback, and the kind of feedback you get from a biology faculty member on an English literature assignment and vice versa can be very, very powerful stuff. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those if you're interested in. We don't present these, right, as something you ought to do verbatim, but they give some indications and you can use them in a way as kind of templates to look at your own assignment. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So there are a lot of features to good assignments. And this last one, very, very important. Giving students cues and clues about what they ought to be looking for and what they ought to attend to and try to achieve. Again, mea culpa here. I think I was near the end. I keep talking about my quote teaching career, but I had a graduate student working with me in a class, and she had several courses from me. Megan Palmer, in fact, she's the head of the Teaching Learning Center now at the Indiana University Medical School in Indianapolis. And we were talking about things one day and the course and so forth and so on. And she said, you know, George, I bet the student papers in this class would be better if they had a clearer idea of what you were looking for. And I thought, well, you know, that's a reasonable request. What is it I'm looking for? And she said, maybe if we develop some rubrics for the papers in this class. And I thought that's a capital idea. Megan, why don't you go off and develop some of these? Well, I discovered working with Megan what most faculty, just about every faculty member discovers when they design rubrics to cue students as well as alert oneself as the instructor what it is we are looking for and what a strong response to the assignment looks like. And so what I discovered, which is what everybody else discovered, my own evaluation of student work was more efficient as a result. I mean, you got to leave room for creativity in these things, of course, but well worth the effort. Next slide, please. So there's been a fair amount of attention paid to rubrics over the last 15, 20 years. This is again, it's AAC&U, their value project where they developed rubrics to be generalized, right, and modified and adapted by individual faculty members across the board. These rubrics for these 15 areas. Next slide, please. And you can get a lot of information off the AAU website, AAC&U website about these rubrics. And of course, this work is ongoing at UAGC. Next slide, please. Thanks to Tricia Lauer and her colleagues. This is one of your institutional learning outcomes rubrics, critical logic and critical thinking. I'm sorry you can't really make it out. This is my problem, not Tricia's. My lifting what she sent to put this on the big screen here, but moving, you know, from right to left here, from what ought to be kind of basic competence through different milestones of improved performance along multiple areas. And then getting to a point where this is what we expect of all students to be able, how they ought to be able to perform at the very end, right? So rubrics are very, very important. Lots of good work going on at UAGC in this regard. And here's another opportunity, an invitation, I guess, for more folks to get involved with this work. Perfect. How did you know I was thinking about the next slide? You're reading my mind. So how is it that then, with all this work going on, how can we be confident that what we're trying to do with and for our students is actually occurring? This cartoon is an all-time favorite of mine. You're only as pretty as you feel. And every time we look at our own work, we tend to come away with a somewhat more rosy picture of what we're doing. And sometimes it's accurate. Often some improvement can be done more. Next slide, please. So what is it? What are some of the steps we can take? Well, curriculum mapping is one place, one area where we can improve our work. And there are a lot of benefits, for doing this, as the bullet points on this slide are suggesting. All right, we chief among them, we can identify gaps. It is really quite common for faculty members. Again, I'm holding myself accountable here to think that across the courses that add up to a program of study, we are covering the things that I think you've jumped ahead here on me somehow. Oh, I know you're probably, well, this is good. You're trying to keep me on my toes. I don't know what's going on here either. The point is, oftentimes what we think is a comprehensive program of study aligned with the outcomes that we have stipulated as being important, oftentimes there are gaps. And when we better understand who is doing what toward what ends in given courses, then we're in a better position to advise students, not only in terms of course sequencing, but in other ways in terms of improving academic advising and so forth and so on. So curriculum mapping, again, something that's going on at UAGC as well. Next slide, please. And the next slide we're coming to. So I've already mentioned some of these things. The question, often arises, how many learning objectives can you squeeze in to a single course, right? Curriculum mapping can sometimes help us understand that. Is there a lot of redundancy in a program of study? That's another outcome. Now, some redundancy is probably a good thing, especially if we're increasing the level of deep learning as we move through the various outcomes we're after. And in fact, we want to be sure that some of these outcomes are reinforced over the period of time. And we also want to know whether students are able to get enough practice in to demonstrate their proficiencies across various outcomes. And another use of curriculum mapping that is too often underutilized is whether we're using this information to explain to students what it is they ought to know as a result of this course and what they can expect in the next sequence of courses. Next slide, please. So we want to focus on learning outcomes, certainly, and the matrix that these two-dimensional matrix, I'm going to show you one here in a moment. Again, thanks to Tricia and her colleagues, but we're going to look at, just take a glimpse at the Intro to Sociology course at UAGC. You can read, the 7 kind of core learning outcomes. We're not going to focus on the specific outcomes here, just to give us a visual display with the next slide, please. What this looks like if you've not done this kind of work. So here we've got the intro course. There are 7 outcomes along the vertical the column on the left here. And as is expected, we can't presume or assume or even try to cover all 7 outcomes for a program of study in a single course. And that's where you end up with the empty cells. Now, what you'd like to be able to see, which we're not going to do today, is what do the subsequent courses look like in the curricular mapping? And when you put them all together, are all of these outcomes given enough coverage as a student moves through the sociology program? Next slide, please. So this is a faculty-driven activity. This is not, administrators doing this work. And when maps are built, we assume this is multiple faculty members working together. And one question to ask, just to kind of hold ourselves somewhat accountable, if 2 faculty members did this work on their own, would they end up with the same map? Meaning, you can't really do this work individually in isolation from colleagues, because you can't know really what's going on, even if you look at course outlines and syllabi. You know, I'm often reminded of the old adage, there are what, four curricula in a university. The first is what's written in the catalog. The second is what appears on the course syllabus. The third is what actually is taught in that particular course over the 5-week period. And the fourth, the most important, what do students actually experience? And of course, we want to get at all those things, but particularly the last two. What is taught, what's emphasized? Hopefully it's aligned well with what's on the syllabus, but what do students actually experience? Next slide, please. So coming toward the end here, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on high impact practices, but this is a movement in American higher education right now, and it's of great interest because these kinds of activities, as you let your eyes roll down the list, are associated with some unusually positive outcomes, unusually good benefits. And there's something that UAGC needs to consider, is considering. In fact, there was a team, as many of you may know, that was off last week at the AAC&U Summer Institute on High Impact Practices. I've highlighted learning communities here because there is a group of folks who are working assiduously to try to flesh that kind of high impact practice, flesh it out further, determine how it might take root across different courses and programs at UAGC. Next slide, please. The reason there's such interest in this, we came out in 2008 with this initial monograph, which was sponsored by AAC&U, based upon half a dozen 8 years of work at the National Survey of Student Engagement, which I directed back in the day. And we discovered some really, I'm going to overstate it just slightly, amazing relationships between student engagement in that list of 11 activities I showed you and outcomes. For example, next slide, please. This is why there's such a buzz here now, and not just in the US, but in other parts of the world. If a student does a HIP, a high impact practice, one of those 11 things I just showed you, they're more likely to finish what they start, more likely to earn a degree, they're more likely to report, and we see other evidence, independent evidence of student self-reports, they're more likely to show greater learning outcomes. Participation in a HIP has what we've referred to as salutary effects. That is, while in general, all students benefit from having been involved in one of these activities that has a substantial experiential learning base, while all students benefit, the students who get the biggest bump, positive bump from their participation are those from historically underserved populations. These are students who are first in their family to attend college. They're often less well prepared academically for university study. They are from low income backgrounds, and they often are, not often, but they may well be from racially minoritized backgrounds in the context of the institution. These historically underserved students show bigger bumps in their likelihood to persist, as well as gain from the learning activities. And if a student's involved in one of these, in my language, the psychological size of the institution shrinks. And by that, I mean, students now have a greater sense of belonging, of fit, which is unfortunately one of the things that encourages students to leave an institution before they complete their study. And in almost all of these, students are doing some of this applied work, hands-on, deep integrative learning. The SUNY system, you know, the 64 campuses, 32 2-year campuses, 32 4-year campuses now require all students to do at least one applied learning experience. University of Wisconsin system is doing similar kinds of things. And one of the reasons is, and all of these places want students to do more than one, because if students do 2, 3, and 4, they benefit even more. This cumulative additive effect of participating in a HIP. So this is why the buzz is out there. It's why more than half of provosts, when we asked them in the last NALOA service about HIPs, more than half of them say that we're trying to increase the number of opportunities that are available and the number of students who are participating. Next slide, please. So we're at a point now where we can entertain comments and questions, and hopefully what we might have to say will be of some use to in that sense. Paul, I'm going to put it up to you.
Yeah, I'm looking in the chat, and we had asked for comments and questions. And just to also let you know, Dr. Koo, I put in the chat the invitation to the high impact practices and prepared engaged citizens in the context of work ready graduate at AACNU tomorrow, the one that you suggested. So the registration link to that presentation. So I wanted to make sure and include that for
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's see here. Any questions?
Well, there was a lot going on in the chat. Things kept flashing by my screen here.
Well, I know one of the questions early on was the interest in, Christy, in your kind of interactive assignments and how other instructors might be able to learn how to build those.
Well, the process that I took was I often was into the course design several weeks, and I usually left my learning activities till the end and tried to determine which ones would be the best to use as an interactive assignment. And so I worked with an ed tech designer, and I just put my information all within a PowerPoint, and then I sent it to them, and they're the ones who actually brought it to life with everything. So I didn't have that design capability. I just came up with the idea, and then they helped me from there.
And Christy, this is Haley Pessner. I'm helping support Paul in this. I was thinking through that question, which I think was asked by one of our associate faculty. And I think a good resource, if associate faculty were interested in contributing to assignment design, is they could reach out to their lead faculty for a discussion on that.
Yes, that's a great idea as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and a question just came in. Let me get to it. Teresita says, Dr. Koo, what is your favorite hip and why?
It's my left hip, and it's the one that was most recently repaired. You know, that's you know, what's your favorite child? Right kind of question. So I don't have a favorite. I think I've highlighted learning communities here because with several others, that particular high impact practice has a lot of pretty good research underscoring it. The learning community has been around as we know it in the field maybe for 30, 35 years. And what I like about it is it is modifiable so that in addition, and by the way, the definition of learning communities here is 2 or more linked courses. That is, and this is a challenge for UAGC. And so we're going to talk more about learning communities down the line and how one would design a freestanding, standalone course that has many of the characteristics of a learning community. But the point of 2 or more linked courses is that students with instructor cooperation and collaboration, you can design assignments that cut across 2 or 3 fields of knowledge, right? So you're giving students practice in that very important deep integrative learning activity that does not come naturally to most people. Plus, the learning community has the advantage of putting students together in separate, or if you will, different learning situations. So they get to know one another instead of just having a course and then leaving the university and never having more interaction beyond the classroom with other students. It's a disadvantage. So linking courses is very, very important. But what I want to talk about later, not today, but perhaps at another point in time, is how one might design the same kind of situation in a single course. It's a challenge when you're limited to 5 weeks, certainly. But some of these others are very, very powerful. The service community-based learning, which is something that UAGC can do more of, probably. There's often a pushback saying, well, our students are too busy. But when an assignment if an assignment requires a student to go out in the field, and that field may be not very far away, it could very well be the workplace for that matter. Students end up learning a lot more about the content as they see the relevance and meaning of it unfold. We lose a lot of students in higher education because they simply do not see relevance and meaning in what they are studying. So our efforts and what high impact practices do, most of them, is to put students in situations where they can see the relevance of what they're doing. Now, certainly internships do that in a meaningful way, but oftentimes they're not slotted into a student's program of study until late. There's a lot of work going on at UAGC now, thinking about how you would take the qualities of a first-year seminar and embed that into early coursework. And the importance there is, how do we get students to get some experience in active and collaborative learning? So up and down this list, there are many positives, and that's why they're called high impact practices. But the last thing I'll say here about this is, if you push me to the push me to the wall. I got these questions all the time from reporters when I was working in the early years with Nessie. What's the most engaging activity? What's the single most important thing a student should do? Well, in the middle of that list are collaborative assignments and projects. And this is far more, of course, as you well know, than teaching students how to play nice, right, in the sandbox. What we're doing here is what almost every person who comes and finishes at UAGC will do, and that is they're going to go into the workforce. And what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to work effectively with other people, oftentimes with people that they've never met before, who come from backgrounds that are very different and distinct from their own. And so the more practice that students can get, and it's just not these experiences with diversity that shows up later in the list, it's learning how to take advantage of what other people know and use that to advantage for the common good, for betterment. So that was my long-winded way around the barn of saying it's not just my left hip, but it's virtually all these hips that can show a great benefit. And the question for UAGC is, how do we accommodate these kinds of activities? And what we'll talk about at some subsequent point in time are the features of what makes a high impact practice high impact. And they can be induced, they can be used in any course, in any discipline. I didn't think we'd have time to go into these today, and I'm sorry I didn't, but we'll do that at some future date.
Thank you, Dr. Koo. I appreciate that. Let's see, we have another question from Stephanie Fink, and Stephanie asks, many of the work-ready capacities noted are hallmarks of liberal arts degrees. However, these degrees are increasingly being eliminated. Why are the liberal arts more relevant than ever, or aren't they?
Well, you're talking to a liberal arts college graduate here, so you're going to get a biased opinion. And so I would just say this is not me talking, but again, in another setting, I hope we can take a deeper dive into what employers say they want. Employers don't say they want liberal arts education. What employers, and I'm using employers here because it's kind of the coin of the realm for most of your students, and it's the coin of the realm for what most parents want today. They want to be assured that their son or daughter is going to get the kind of education that will prepare them to succeed in the workforce. So employers don't use the language of liberal arts education. They use the language of the competencies that students and the proficiencies and the dispositions that students develop as a result of the liberal arts education. And so we flashed a few of those earlier, right? Critical thinking, logical reasoning, the ability to interact effectively with other people, but the reading and the writing and the problem solving, right? So when you ask employers what they're looking for are the outcomes of a liberal arts educational experience. Now, we can divine those and we can develop those in other kinds of programs of study as well. And one of my worries is, for example, with the emphasis on short-term credentialing, is that there's just not enough time for students to develop some of these dispositions like intrapersonal competence. Where in the curriculum are we giving students an opportunity to develop resilience, and what kinds of assignments and classroom activities do students have to demonstrate conscientiousness, right? Sticking with a sticky problem until they figured out how to manage or work with their colleagues to come up with alternative solutions. These are activities that we can design into almost any curriculum, and they're the kinds of things that students draw meaning and relevance from. So in my mind, the liberal arts education has gotten a bad rap because it's presented as something that a very small group of people, the elite, get to do, right? Which is the farthest thing from what we can imagine. So Tony Carnevale runs the Center for Education in the Workforce at Georgetown, and his point is the people who succeed in the workforce and in life are those who graduate from college, who have developed these cross-cutting skills, the kinds of things we've just been talking about that are needed in every form of human endeavor. That's how I see liberal arts education. Sometimes we call it liberal education. That doesn't wash well, with half of the population today who are one side of the median and the other. So we can talk more about that at another time. So I'm not necessarily bullish on liberal arts education. I'm very bullish on the kinds of outcomes that we expect from a robust undergraduate experience.
I've got another question for you, Dr. Koo, from Dr. Newton Miller. What things should we be aware of in order to ensure that HIPs we choose to embed in our course design are culturally responsive, such that they consider the cultural capital of at-potential student populations?
Run that by me one more time, will you?
What things should we be aware of in order to ensure that the HIPs we choose to embed in our course design are culturally responsive, such that they consider the cultural capital of at-potential student populations?
Yeah, this is a this is an important question, and it kind of comes back to what I was what I touched on when I was talking about learning communities, for example. And so what would work not just for a learning community, but for any course, is to invite students to co-design parts of the class. And this begins with what we might call reciprocal expectations. That is, the instructor, of course, sets up the course design, the kinds of assignments, tentative assignments, and then invites students to comment on their relevance and meaning to them. We want to spend enough time doing that to establish a relationship of trust in the classroom, and opportunities for feedback. Now, we can get pretty deep in the weeds pretty quick about this. And so I don't want to be misunderstood. I do think it's the responsibility of the instructor to determine which outcomes are relevant for the program of study, and then create an environment in which students can begin to reinterpret and own them as their own. I worry a little bit about students saying, this is not me, this is not who I am, this offends me. Then we've got to enter into a conversation about what is it that is problematic and offensive, and reorient or restate the learning outcomes so that they have some relevance and meaning to students. This is a challenging kind of environment and a challenging thing. We want to, how can I say this? We want to be sure that all students are welcome, and all students can attain the outcomes. They can complete what we have to study here. I taught in a highly ranked master's program for years, and in that first class hour, I simply said, look, you were admitted here, and every one of you is going to graduate. Now, let's get to work on that, right?
Outstanding. Well, it looks like we're 3 minutes from the end of our time, and this might be an appropriate place to end. And so thank you, Dr. Koo and Dr. McMahon, for your timely presentation. Everyone attending the June colloquium, please complete the follow-up survey. I posted a new link in the chat for that. And the survey will also be available with the recording of this presentation on the AU CETL YouTube channel. It will also be emailed directly to the participants and found on the CETL website as well. A certificate of attendance will be provided to all participants via email. So stay tuned to your email inbox, the CETL website, and the CETL social media for details about our next quarter's CAS Colloquium later this summer. And we look forward to that. And really excited in the future to be able to hear more from you, Dr. Koo, and even from you, Dr. McMahon. So thank you so much for just providing some really great things for us to really think about and even plan on putting into practice.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all. Thank you, Christy. Until next time.